Living Dead. I'm Damon Martin.
And I'm Patrick Guerra.
And Patrick, today we are joined by a very special guest. And I want to introduce our guest by first heaping a whole lot of praise on his work because long before we knew we were going to be doing this interview, when we did this we started doing this podcast 4 years ago. And early on, I think I messaged Patrick and I was like, have you seen this documentary called In Search of Darkness? I am obsessed with this thing. And I watched it like 4 times, and then there was a second one. And I watched it like 4 times. And then there was a third one, and I watched it like 4 or 5 times. It is like on constant repeat. When I need like a comfort movie to put on while I'm just kind of like in the living room, hanging out with my dogs, whatever I'm doing, I put these on. That's how much they mean to me. So we are honored to be joined by the man behind these films and the upcoming In Search of Darkness 1990 to 1994, the director himself, David Weiner. David, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Hey, it's so glad to be here. I'm so glad to be here. I'm an it. And I really appreciate you guys. And the intro that you gave it means a lot to me because these are documentaries that are by fans for fans. Creator VC that makes the In Search of Darkness trilogy and now In Search of Darkness 90s and all sorts of other cool geek stuff, geek-core stuff, nerdcore stuff is the kind of stuff that I think is it's by fans for fans. We really care about this stuff.
And I have to echo what Damon said real quick, is that I consider the In Search of Darkness trilogy for the 80s like almost like a holy text. Like, you've got to have these things in your back pocket as a horror fan. And I'm right there with Damon. I had those on, and they're about 3 to 5 hours, varying depending on the series that you're watching. It's comfort stuff. It's important stuff, and it's history. You get the people behind these movies talking about them. This is important. This is like lingua franca for like 80s horror. You gotta have it under your belt. If you haven't seen these movies, you gotta see them. And of course, David Weiner's here today because he's got more. He's got even more to talk about, which is great.
I think these movies, especially if you're a huge horror fan, is that you understand that on the surface it's violent. It might be something that is not appealing to the average person, but for us it's like comfort food. It's a comfort blanket. There's a lot of nostalgia for what was happening when we first saw these movies, where we were, who we were with, and that's why these things mean a lot to us. And that's why so many of these movies, they might not be considered the best, but they're the best to us, and that's very important. And I think we get that, but a lot of people don't quite get that.
So when I watched In Search of Darkness through the 80s series, like I always hold the 80s in a certain fondness because I became a horror fan at probably too young of an age. I fully admit I was watching movies I should not have been watching when I was like 7, 8, 9 years old, 100%. And I lived across the street from a video store, so I always used to go over to the horror section and do what we all did. We look at the VHS cover. Oh, this looks awesome. I'd rent it and take it home and watch it. I became obsessed. But the reality is, I learned more about horror and became a true horror fan in the 90s when I was a teenager, because then I was actually able to go to the movies and really take myself and see films in the theater. We were literally, right before we got on this interview, I was like, oh yeah, I saw Natural Born Killers in the theater. I saw Candyman in the theater. I saw New Nightmare in the theater. I could look at the list of movies that are in this documentary and I was like, oh, I saw that in the theater. I saw Buffy the Vampire Slayer in the theater. Like this is like when my true movie going experience. So I'm curious from your perspective, because in horror fandom, the 80s are held in such high regard, of course, because it was just like an iconic era for horror films, slasher films, just a real... What was your relationship with the 90s films? Because I feel like the 90s horror kind of gets lost in the mix when we talk about great horror. Like, people don't mention it alongside 80s. We talk about current horror films, the elevated horror, whatever you want to call it. I'm curious, like, what your relationship was with the 90s horror.
I have to, before I answer that question, I lived across the street from a video store as well. And I ended up working at that video store. It was like a little mom and pop shop. And I have lots of happy memories, not only of working there, but taking strategic videos home. That's a whole different story, you know. But you guys know what it's like, you know. I don't know if you've been a video store clerk yourself at any given time, but you have access to pretty much anything you want, and so it's really great. You just have to sort of slip it by your parents, you know, because I was. Um, the 80s was such a powerful decade in terms of the output. Um, I think because there was just a preponderance of creativity and straight to video and just amazing movies in the theater and all sorts of subgenres, that it got to the point where it no longer was a stigma. It was incredibly popular. But the problem was there was starting to get fatigue. You know, I think with a lot of the sequels, you know, Friday the tail end of the 80s, you have Friday the 13th Part 8. You've got 5, you know, Nightmare on Elm Street movies. A lot of people felt like it was sort of like squeezing a lemon, you know. But for me, I didn't quite feel that way. I was in my 20s in the 90s, and so I was just getting out of film school, and so I felt an obligation to see every single movie that I could. The majority of those movies were in theaters. I of course had my video store experience, but I also kind of, this was then, not now, had a little bit of a snob attitude towards the direct to video stuff, because since I was like a film school guy, I was just like, well, it didn't get a theatrical release. It's not important. Thus, many years later, when I came to truly, really appreciate a lot of that straight to video stuff, whether it was Full Moon Entertainment stuff or, you know, Troma or Roger Corman stuff, you know, if it had a Trimark logo, I was like, this has got to be good. I grew to really appreciate that stuff. But for me, it was really about the 90s. I think ultimately just gets overlooked for a couple reasons. A, there's not a definitive line. The 80s was still just kind of happening. I mean, all the villains were still there while we were introducing, like you said, you know, Candyman or Pennywise. You know, you still had Pinhead. You still had, you know, Chucky movies were going strong. You had Leatherface. You know, Jason was hanging out in hell, you know, all that kind of stuff. So it really felt very much like the 80s, and especially all that straight to video stuff. It was just peak practical effects. So it never really changed. It was sort of like that was all there. But on the big screen, I think the studios were really trying to embrace it and bring in A-list stars to do some more horror stuff. So you got Francis Ford Coppola directing Bram Stoker's Dracula, and let's get, you know, Gary Oldman will be the ultimate Dracula, but let's get Keanu Reeves and Winona Ryder and Anthony Hopkins to chew the scenery. You know, Kenneth Branagh was like, not to be outdone. I'm like, well, I'm going to put Mary Shelley, her name, in front of Frankenstein, and I'll do my version of Frankenstein and get Robert De Niro to play the monster. You know, even with De Niro in Cape Fear, you know, Scorsese is sort of putting a foot in really, really, really dark territory. That's not gangster territory, but for him, it's very, very dark. So the output, I think a lot of times the studios were like, I don't want a horror movie by name, but I want a horror movie by content. Let's call it a thriller. Let's call it a psychological thriller. Let's call it an erotic thriller. Um, and so people look back at this era and they kind of dismiss it because they're like, well, what was going on? It was just like, you know, sequels and franchises. You know, there are a couple big studio films, but everything was a thriller. Everything was a serial killer subgenre film. What is that exactly? But there's much more to the story, and we can talk all about that because there was a tremendous amount of stuff introduced. And I, at the time when I was watching all of this stuff, I was loving it as it was going along. But I kind of fell into the trap of, oh, another thriller, another police procedural, you know. Yet Silence of the Lambs could shake up and disrupt, you know, what seemed like a police procedural and just blow everyone away, and then influence the next 10 years of filmmaking. A lot going on.
Can we expand before we get into some of the nastier and dirtier stepchildren of the early 90s? Just expand a little bit more on what is essentially like a return to the kind of award-winning horror films. We had a lot of that going on in the late 60s and 70s. The 80s sort of turned into sort of a a crank, like they were cranking them out. It was a machine of horror. So the quality started to dip, even though the fun never stopped.
Hmm.
But you every movie you just rifled off, they're all like Academy Award level movies. These aren't just
Yeah,
minor movies.
for all the straight to video, it's very memorable in a couple different categories. One is all the direct to video stuff. I like to call it straight to video, but DTV, plenty of stuff on the VHS shelves. You have these A-listers, Tom Cruise is like, I'm going to play a vampire, an interview with the vampire. Rob Reiner's like, I'm going to take a Stephen King movie and put my spin on it, and he comes out with Misery, and it's amazing. Um, you've got Adrian Lyne doing Jacob's Ladder, which is arguably a very hard to pin in terms of genre title because it really straddles a bunch of things. But that's horror through and through, especially if you're Jacob living through this nightmare of what this story's about. But then you have Ron Underwood directing Tremors, and you got Kevin Bacon joining. I remember I couldn't believe Kevin Bacon was doing some. I hadn't seen it. I'd only heard good things, but before I heard good things, I was just like, Kevin Bacon's doing some like Jaws ripoff Underground Worms. What the heck is going on here? And I think a hallmark for me for this era is there were so many films that just took me by surprise and just absolutely entertained me through and through when my expectations were low. And so, a movie like Tremors, but also say a movie like Night of the Living Dead, the Tom Savini remake, which I went to go on a Friday night because I'm like, yeah, of course I'm going to see, the Tom Savini movie, but I'm sure it's going to suck. And it's a remake of, a classic, a Romero classic. And I remember saying, this is amazing. This is an absolute step forward. And this is a Hallmark film, much like, John Carpenter's The Thing in terms of, doing a remake and doing a remake right, or Cronenberg's The Fly. I think it really stands high in terms of that. There was a lot going on. I keep on saying there was a lot going on, but in my head, I just want to keep on talking about more. So I'll just stop,
Well,
and please add to that question.
what's funny is we mentioned like the critically acclaimed because we did a review for Silence of the Lambs a couple months ago. It was a long episode because of how iconic that movie is, and I know like some hardcore film fans will be like, "That's not really horror." I'm like, "It's absolutely horror. Silence of the Lambs is a horror film." But Patrick mentioned it there. Like we actually did have some real Academy Award-winning films, like Misery, of course. James Wood, and of course, Kathy Bates won an Oscar for that movie. And I think now people hold Candyman in a much higher reverence than maybe they did in the '90s. But it's funny because for a lot of like some of the horror community, it's almost like the '90s, the early '90s in particular, which is where this particular documentary takes place. It's almost like the redheaded stepchild of the horror community. Like we kind of disown it. But when I start looking through all the films, when I was doing research and watching the trailer and things like that, I'm like, there's a lot of movies in here I love. Like this was not like Brain Scan is such an underrated. I love Brain Scan. Like I absolutely adore Brain Scan. Edward Furlong is great in
Team
that movie.
Trickster.
Yeah, I loved it. And even though listen, I love the Buffy the Vampire Slayer TV series. Like I obsessed with the TV series. I still love the original film. I mean, you got Donald Sutherland, you got Rutger Hauer. I mean, Paul Rubens, of course, Pee Wee Herman, who we just lost sadly recently. But like, there's so many. Like, I don't. A lot of people kind of talk about almost like in hushed tones, like, oh, it's a '90s film. We can't talk about '90s horror. I'm like, you know what? There's some really good '90s horror films. Like, don't treat it like it's the redheaded stepchild of the horror industry. There's some great films.
I think my theory is that it's sort of a combination of big studios wanting to call things thrillers instead of horror. You did have a bunch of the notable horror films that we're talking about the first half at the time, but there was still franchise fatigue, like I was mentioning. So with all these sequels, I think people sort of like to dismiss, well, what was new? but it wasn't, Candyman was something, like you said, didn't resonate until much later. But at the same time, you had these great filmmakers who were really stretching their legs and trying to work with this transition time to sort of either move forward or move away from horror, like Cronenberg, for example. Yet you have Joe Dante doing Small Soldiers, but at the same time you have like John Carter or even like Catherine Bigelow, moving into like Point Break and stuff like that. But at the same time, you've got John Carpenter doing like In the Mouth of Madness, which is really like the ultimate, it's like the summit of Stephen King and Lovecraft, and that's a film that's incredibly underrated. But I think also with the pinnacle of practical effects meeting the nascent baby steps, and awkward baby steps at that, of CGI. I think because so much, at least, I'm speaking for myself and projecting here, but so much CGI derailed my enjoyment early on of a lot of these films. I was one of those people who would dismiss a lot of these films, yet coming back to it, there still is a tremendous amount of practical effects, or arguably, it's kind of quaint. You have to admire that all the creativity leading up to the use strategically of whether they're morphing, in Sleepwalkers, or Trickster, appearing and just coming out, or even Hellraiser 3 in the big, club. There's lots of CGI in that sequence as well. You look at that and you have to admire that producers and filmmakers were trying to move forward with the craft, with new technology that allows them to do things that take much longer or are much more difficult with practical effects. And at the time, they might think, well, maybe people don't care and everyone's kind of obsessed with this new technology. Let's give it a go. But the big problem and the big caveat there was everyone saw Jurassic Park and said, I want to do that. What they didn't quite realize is A, there's a lot of money involved, and B, most of it is Stan Winston practical effects. And so it seamlessly blends with a lot of the CG that's in there, but they didn't quite realize where the practical effects end and the CGI begins. Short of like when you see the brontosauruses or brachiosauruses, now screwing it up, right?
Yeah, I think it's brachiosauruses. Yeah.
Yeah. In the beginning, that to me, I think is probably the one shot that doesn't age very well.
Yep.
But even the Gallimimuses look really good and everything like that. The point is, people thought, well, we should do that too. And then when they realized that they can't afford to do it that way, and it's not easily blending. The Thing prequel had a problem with this, blending the practical effects with the CGI effects. Even many years later, the CGI won out, and the practical effects, which were all done almost entirely, all had to take a back seat, and it was just an ugly hybrid, and it didn't work despite it being, I think, a great movie. So these are, I think, some of the guilty reasons, and then you have Scream later on. I know, the sort of the teen cycle, the Craft, and I Know What You Did Last Summer, and the Blair Witch Project. They kind of stole the thunder towards the end of the decade, where I think when people look back, that's something where they could just say that's something that is easily contained in an idea and a description. And we could basically take a whole decade of work and say, that's what it means. That's what it was about. That's what was really big. That's what resonated. And everything for the first half is kind of forgotten.
And speaking about decades of work, let's talk about the process a little bit, because I'm a filmmaker myself, so I'm fascinated. When you try to take an undertaking like this, now it's very well known. The In Search of Darkness series is crowdfunded, so that's how you start. But this is for each installment is about a year-long process. Am I not right? And I'm just curious, like, what's the first step? I mean, maybe not the first step, but just the idea of like, I have this vast undertaking in front of me. I've got to get together talent to talk about these films. I've got to get clips and permission for these clips, etc. This is a massive undertaking. Why do you put yourself through it? Besides the fact that you absolutely love this stuff, I know this is hard work.
Oh, well, thank you for recognizing that, because I think a lot of people are just like, where, how come it's not out this year? Or how come you didn't fit this in a 4.5 or a 5 hour film? And how could you, overlook that? Well, Sisyphus is my spirit animal. And so constantly pushing a boulder up the hill is kind of what I'm into. I, I get the opportunity, Robin Block, who's the CEO, Creator VC, who makes these projects, and is just spectacular at marketing them, and crowdfunding them, and producing these with a lot of creativity with a very small team. And we're a very small team that's in the UK, in Europe, and the US. We're all over, but it's really essentially about 10 of us, give or take, freelancers. Um, Come up with an idea, when after we did, it started with In Search of the Last Action Heroes. And while that was in production, which I didn't direct, that was Oliver Harper. Robin was just like, this is kind of a great structure and formula that you could apply to a bunch of genres and a bunch of decades. Horror would really make sense. What is the best time of horror if I was going to pick a decade? And 80s was the one that really resonated with him, based on his experience and his age, and just what was popular 5 years ago, and at its sort of zenith in terms of the zeitgeist of excitement, of nostalgia. As you guys know, whether consciously or unconsciously, every 25 to 30 years after a decade comes and goes, the people who were prominently, coming of age around that time, now they're in the real world, and, real world responsibilities, they start getting nostalgia. We all start getting nostalgic for something that was 20, 25, 30 years ago. There's somehow we look back, and we all seem to manage to lose a decade when we count back, saying, wait, that was 30 years ago? No way. That had to have only been 20 years ago. So here we are at the 90s. And, the quick story with In Search of Darkness 80s is we crowdfunded it. We found a tremendous amount of positive response. We got to make a movie that wasn't initially going to be a 4.5 hour movie, but the structure just demanded it. Literally, because when you're going from 1980 to 1989, putting chapters in between, it just expands it. And the more people you bring on, the more you have to talk about. I'm so happy that because it did so well, we got to do another one. And because that did so well, which I honestly thought after part two, that was going to be it. We were going to move on to probably another decade, but the response was so positive. Like, now we could really, really go crazy and go, international titles, straight to video titles, the dusty bottom shelf of the video store that no one ever really takes a look at except the horror fans, or the sun bleached titles, we like to call them, right? But we also did In Search of Tomorrow, 80s sci-fi. And I got to do that, and I loved it. And we were going to do the next thing up was In Search of Tomorrow Part 2, more deep dive into 80s sci-fi. But the drumbeat for 90s horror really was loud. What we do is, Robin's great at this with our social media. You put out little feelers, and see how people respond. And so whether it's Instagram or Twitter or X or Facebook, you say, what do you think of Handyman? What do you think of Pennywise? What do you think of X, Y, or Z? And when you see, rather than just, an average amount of response that you might get for any post, truckload of people. Oh, I love this. I love this. You got to do 90s. No more 80s. Move on to 90s. Why aren't you doing 70s yet? But there's a lot of stuff like that. I don't know if I've really answered your question, but that's kind of like, how we kind of dip our toe in the pool in terms of figuring out what to do next. But lastly, I'll say about it is that it is a tremendous amount of work. It is a huge endeavor that we really accomplish for a very small team. But the why do I put myself through it? I'm a fan. I was saying before, and we love to incorporate the fans who love this stuff rather than work in a vacuum. Do a survey, check out social media, see what people are posting. I'll take copious notes. Oh, I didn't know people even know or care about Trickster. BrainScan is now, on the on deck potentially because people are interested in that. That's easy enough to dismiss if you're working in a vacuum. But it's a rewarding endeavor if you do anything, if you love the content, and that makes it really easy, especially when making these movies is kind of like, it's like the Hollywood tour. It's not like you go to one house and you hang out, at Al Pacino's house hoping he's going to get out, and wave at you and stand there all day and wait for something to happen. You just keep on going. There's Al's house, there's Weird Al Yankovic's house, there's where this happens, there's where that happened. You take a look, you spend a little time, you learn a little bit, and then you move on. And that makes it very worthwhile for me because I get to do, even though it's a huge amount of stuff, it keeps it very fun and lively for my mind, when I'm putting this stuff together, especially when I know people are so receptive. That's the
You,
short version of the answer.
you mentioned, David, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned a lot of times when people talk about 90s horror, they talk about the franchises and the sequels. I want to talk to you about that real quick because if you can look behind me, you can see I'm a big franchise horror movie fan with my Scream mask, my Halloween mask. Like I have Nightmare on Elm Street 3 poster right behind me. I am a huge franchise fan. It's funny because the 90s has like the weirdest mix of franchise sequels. Like New Nightmare is actually the T-shirt I'm wearing. I wore it in honor of you being on the show today. I
Very
love New
cool. Very
Nightmare. I
cool.
love Wes Craven's New Nightmare. I'm a huge Nightmare on Elm Street fan. I think like movies like Gremlins 2 is an underrated classic. I love that movie. There's a lot of sequels out there that I think are great, but just being honest, there are some weird sequels in this mix as well in the 90s. Like I was when I was looking through the list, I was like, that came out. It's like that was in. I love the original Basket Case, and I forgot Basket Case 2 and 3 both came out in 1991. I'm curious your relationship with the franchise sequels because it was a really interesting decade, especially in the early 90s. For some of the films, like we got Bride of Reanimator, which is an interesting one. We got Maniac Cop. I actually just watched Maniac Cop like a week ago before we even knew we were talking to you. I'm a huge Tom Atkins fan. And I was like, I want to see Maniac Cop. Maniac Cop 2 came out. Pet Cemetery 2. Like, there's a lot of like weird random sequels in the 90s.
Return of the Living Dead 3. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, everything that you mentioned, there, even Amityville, Warlock films, Amityville sequels. There's a huge amount of them. We were talking about comfort food, Child's Play 2 and 3, and just in that first half. And then, of course, Bride of Chucky a little after that. But there's a comfort factor when you have your horror heroes coming back for more. No one listen, the horror community never cares how anyone dies. Freddy dies in Final Nightmare. Freddy's dead. You put on your 3D glasses. That's the end of Freddy. 3 years later, he's back in New Nightmare, and you're just like, great, excellent. Like, you don't even question it because you want more Freddy. And it's funny you mentioned in the same breath practically Gremlins 2 and New Nightmare. And behind you, you've got Scream, trio that I could see of Scream masks, Ghostface. That's really Wes Craven and Joe Dante playing in sort of meta filmmaking right there. Gremlins is very, self-reflexive, self-effacing, and very, very clever. You have the same thing with New Nightmare, where you have, Heather Langenkamp, Robert Englund, even Wes Craven himself playing themselves on screen, and with a new, Freddy kind of coming into their world. Um, these are sort of the precursors for Scream later, but part of the transition of the 90s was despite all these sequels, which I think all of these filmmakers were trying to appeal to a more intellectual level of storytelling. Even if it was lowest, bottom denominator of just thrills and chills and gore and blood and sex and everything like that, I think for the most part, they were really trying to appeal to more thoughtful storytelling and filmmaking. Wes Craven, top of his game, he also does People Under the Stairs. You got the socio-political elements going on there, yet it's still this ridiculously entertaining film about, urban blight, much like Candyman. Candyman's the dark side, and People Under the Stairs you'd think would be darker, but it's the lighter side of the same coin, you know? But also earlier you mentioned, natural born killers. Um, that's a very smart and savvy take on as a media satire of reality television that was very much emerging at the same time. The Real World had just debuted on MTV, and you got Jerry Springer and Morton Downey Jr. and all these reality show Maury's and all the kind of stuff would all be born in the late 80s, in the 80s, and then in the 90s. It was whether you're following O.J. Simpson on a slow speed chase or something. This was now very much getting into the reality, the step by step, whether the Menendez brothers, I'm kind of all over the map here. Jeffrey Dahmer, all these things merging reality, the hangover of the greed is good 80s was, leading to riots in Los Angeles in the early 90s. Something was going on, and the filmmakers wanted to evolve and to address this and use horror as the best reflection of what's going on, and appeal to a more intellectual crowd, at least in terms of the content, while still being very entertaining. So it's an interesting thing to look at, arguably with all these sequels, Child's Play, like I learned, in terms of like doing surveys and things like that. I love Don Mancini's work. I love the Child's Play movies. We all have our favorites. I was unaware until I literally ran a poll online that, if you had to choose between Child's Play 2 and Child's Play 3, no matter which one you like, because they're both good, 2 is way more popular among horror fans than 3. I don't know if you guys have any skin in the game with that. But that was something where I was just like, I figured it was going to be, 50-50, 60-40, about the same. 90% was like 2. You don't even get it. 2 completely compared to 3.
That makes sense for me. Yeah, I'm a little bit younger than Damon, so I wasn't like a moviegoer in terms of horror. My mom was not going to let me go to those movies, so a lot of it to me came through on cable. And Child's Play 2 is one of those where it's just like, oh, watching this on cable and just going, yep. And like, it's just one of those things that gets burned in your brain.
Absolutely.
Can I ask one just kind of a logistical question here, because obviously again we've been pretty obsessed with the In Search of Darkness um, series. The decision to do it 90 to 94 versus all the 90s. Can you kind of explain like the decision to go from the entire decade to half? Because in my opinion, this is just me. When I saw this announcement, I was thinking, I kind of do separate that, even though I know it's like a 4 year stretch or a 5 year stretch. I understand it, but I also understand the later 90s when you do get Scream, and I call it the Scream era because then you get the Faculty, you get it, it's a whole new genre of horror.
Mm-hmm.
Halloween H2O, like they all spawn from Scream in a lot of ways. I mean, like when Scream came out in '96, that changed horror forever. It changed me. I got back at, like, I was a hardcore horror fan as a kid, stopped watching horror for a few years, and then I watched Scream, and it totally got me back into horror again. Was that like? Can I ask like what was the decision to do it in splits versus a whole decade, then do maybe like a second one of a whole decade?
Yeah, well, it actually kind of goes back to Patrick's question. You turn around one of these films every single year. Well, we've done, if you include In Search of Tomorrow, a trilogy of '80s films and then '80s sci-fi film, all in a 4 year stretch. pandemic, it sort of bleeds into 5 years, but essentially it's every year we turned around a movie. It is a tremendous amount of work. And what happens is there's so much, and we're going to have this problem anyway. But we found that it was more manageable in terms of how we structure this. It's still going to be a long form documentary, but with all the people that we get, all the movies that we talk about, we want to include television stuff this time. There still will be stuff that we just can't get to, but I feel like we can get more if we do it this way. It's really pretty intense to turn around a decade, and then if it does well, go back and do a decade again, and if it does really well, you still have to do a whole decade. There's a certain element of elbow room to be able to do it this way. Even in the in between, you've got every year, you've got a number of movies, but having chapters in between, there's just a little more flexibility in terms of the amount of talent that we get and the type of material that I ultimately script and put together to structure it as a dive into the decade and a celebration of these movies that we all love. It's just it's manageable in a different way, and we get arguably more, even though I'm already expecting you did this and you did this, but you didn't do this. And that's a great problem to have. And I think it's what people ultimately don't realize is because there were so many high profile films, something's got to give at a certain point, especially because there were so many high profile films and straight to video films and television that we want to talk about. At a certain point, do we have, if we do Addams Family, do we do Addams Family Values? If we do, The Stand and It, do we do the Tommy knockers? What at what point, if we're doing gateway horror and talking about, Are You Afraid of the Dark and Erie, Indiana, and X-Files and Twin Peaks and Tales from the Crypt, but we also have the miniseries, sometimes they come back, get put by the wayside. That's the overwhelming thing, because fundamentally something's got to give, and we have to kill our babies. I hate to say it. But leave them wanting more, right?
Absolutely.
Let me ask you guys, because what was really great about the In Search of Darkness trilogy was we started with the heavy hitters, and then we started, and I made a very difficult choice because I didn't know if I was going to be able to make another film. I just focused on North American films. I knew there were amazing, so many straight to video films, so many shot on video films, so many international films. I just stuck with popular heavy hitters and a number of eclectic films within that. Once we got to 2, and especially 3, we really got to go to town with international films and straight to video stuff and shot on video. I want to approach In Search of Darkness 1990 to 1994 more like In Search of Darkness 3. But that also kind of means that if we do more of the straight to video stuff, we got to have Dr. Giggles, or you got to have Frankenhooker, does that mean I can't quite get to, the dark half, or I can't get to, what is it now? It's on the tip of my tongue. I don't know, The Vanishing, or even like, Hocus Pocus, or Needful Things, or, Nightmare Before Christmas, that kind of stuff like that. What do we want? What do you guys want?
You just reminded me of The Vanishing and how obsessed with it as a kid. Like it was like I just remember it would be like flashes of imagery and going like, that looks dangerous. The 90s have like this whole dangerous vibe to them. There's a little more of an edge to the 90s over the 80s. And I think it's because like you're saying with the 80s, with that greed is good, is like we were sort of living in Rome, if you will, all bets were off. We could go as big as we wanted to. And it was, and the movies started kind of laughing at themselves near the tail end of the 80s. But in the 90s, there was a little bit of anger. There was a little bit of that fallout, like you mentioned earlier, and that fallout turns into edginess. So, I mean, I, I know I have a lot of faith in what 90 to 94 is going to look like because of the curation that you did with the last three films and installments in this series. That I know that I'm always going to be wanting more because that's what, that's just horror people. We always want more, but I'm very confident in your picks for 90 to 94.
And
Well, thank you.
let me throw out. I'll say this. I'll sit less on the fence than Patrick did just there. I'll say this. I loved the original In Search of Darkness. When I saw it, I was like, this is because this was what me and my friends sat around and did. We talked about horror films, and I was like, this is awesome. When you got to In Search of Darkness 2, you started digging into some of the films that I hadn't seen. Like I would say In Search of Darkness, I would say I've probably seen 90% of those movies, at least. In Search of Darkness 2, it started getting into where like, ooh, I haven't seen this. And then hearing guys like Corey Taylor or whoever talk about it passionately, I was like, ooh, I want to see that now. And then by part 3, we're going really deep dive. And I'm like, ooh, I've never seen this. I've never seen this. And it made me go out and seek out these films. So I'm going to be honest and say, I like the obscure stuff. I like the stuff that you don't see every day because while I adore Silence of the Lambs, it's one of the greatest films ever made. I've seen that movie 30 times. It's a blast for me to hear people talk about movies that I haven't seen or that I'm not as familiar with. So that's one of my favorite parts about In Search of Darkness is because I get to discover things as well. Because as well versed as I like to believe I am on horror, I haven't seen everything. And that's part of my love of these documentaries is like, ooh, what's this? Why have I never heard of that? I think
Well,
I want to say Basket Case may have been one of the ones where I was like, what is this? And I went out and sought it out, and I love Basket Case now.
but what would you say? Listen, I'm not saying what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to do, but I'm very interested in your take on it. What if 1991 that Silence of the Lambs came out, right? And so what if we cover 1991, but we don't cover Silence of the Lambs? We cover more eclectic stuff, yet we do a chapter on Silence of the Lambs, exploding and influencing a whole subgenre of serial killer films in a chapter that discusses the topic. Would you feel like, wow, Silence of the Lambs is the biggest movie, of the first half of the 90s, Oscar winner and so on. They didn't cover it. I can't believe it.
I
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
I love what I enjoy about the chapters too is I like the deep dive on those kind of things. The deep dive on the music. You did a chapter, I believe, on one of my favorite actors, Barbara Crampton. Seeing her reborn in that was so awesome to see. The effects, the practical effects. There was a segment on that, things like that. Like I like those, so I think it works either way. Like I think you could spend 3 or 4 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever it is, talking about Silence of the Lambs, but that chapter, because you're absolutely right, like that was people understood like even more because as Patrick said earlier, like the 80s became kind of almost like a meat grinder. Like they were putting out a lot of content and it was good. I love the 80s, but it wasn't that highbrow horror like it wasn't Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist and Jaws and things like that. We kind of returned to that in the 90s, and Silence of the Lambs changed everything. And like I said, there are people who are like, oh, it's not horror. It is horror. And like they were fighting, they were trying to battle against it. That's what I love about that film. So I think like you can tackle it either way, but I think the chapter is a great idea because that movie did change everything. Like we looked at horror differently after Silence of the Lambs because it and you mentioned serial killer, like I would argue that movie, I wouldn't say people were never obsessed with, I mean, I think since, the Manson family, people have been obsessed with weird cult figures, but that movie kind of changed our perspective on films featuring serial killers or featuring that kind of genre. So yeah, like I don't think you can really go wrong either way.
And to kind of echo what Damon was getting on about with the discovery process when watching the 80s installments, I remember during that time using In Search of Darkness to go, oh, we should talk about this film because like I really want to see it based on what I've seen there. So I think you can win you're going to win either way because you're going to bring up films that I certainly didn't see during that time because of my age and because of the access. If it's something that went straight to video and didn't necessarily end up on Cinemax, well, I didn't probably see it. And so now I go, oh well, I gotta check that out. And seeing the enthusiasm from the talent on screen talking about these movies, that gets people engaged, and it opens up a much bigger world for everybody. I mean, it does a service to the community, is what it does.
Cool. You guys are giving me some helpful answers, so I appreciate that.
Uh,
I mean, I'm always looking. I'm always. I pay close attention to what people say. You know, it's always great when people say wonderful things, but I pay attention. You know, I read Letterboxd, and people do not pull their punches to for Letterboxd, and I find it actually very constructive when people say, I loved it, but this didn't work, or that didn't work, or why this or why that." I to that, you know. And listen, it's always nice when you get 5 stars. This is the best thing. This is my comfort food. This is my childhood. And then you get a 1 star or a no star that says, "Why the fuck is this 4.5 hours?" You know, one of my favorites, by the way.
then you get the twisted guy like me who's like, could you make it 7 hours? Is there any way you can make a 7 hour version of this? Because I would love a 7 hour version.
How do you lawnmower man it right into my brain?
Yeah, like that's how like I rewatched these things. So I was actually telling Patrick beforehand, like these are like my comfort movies, and like because they were on Shutter. The first one disappeared off Shutter. What's going on? I was like, I can't find the first one now. I was like, the second and third. I'm not even kidding. Like about a month ago, I went looking because I had watched the second and third one more recently. So I was like, let me go back and rewatch the first one because it had been a little while and it wasn't there. And I was like, no, I need the first one back.
I know it disappeared. Part two and part three is there, but all I could say is streaming is fleeting and physical media is forever. And I'll use this opportunity to plug, I don't know if you guys know, I don't even know if you guys have In Search of Darkness in your hands, but for those who don't and want it, one of the reasons why I'm talking to you guys about this is, you know, we're running a campaign between now and Halloween night at the end of stroke of midnight. If you go to 90shorrordoc.com, you can get pre-order In Search of Darkness 90s. But what we're also doing is we are repackaging the trilogy, where you could buy the trilogy in one disc. You know, it's got all 3 movies, you know, in one package, basically. And so if you missed out on any of the In Search of Darkness movies, or you just don't have it because you're always watching it on Shudder and, you know, Amazon and AMC Plus and so on and so forth, now you can get it. And what's cool is that because it's In Search of Darkness the In Search of Darkness trilogy, that's done and ready, we can turn that around and it gets shipped right before Christmas, which is very cool.
Oh well, I know what I'm doing as soon as we finish here. I'll be buying.
Yes.
Yeah, I bought In Search of Tomorrow on Vimeo. You had like the Vimeo version, so I have that on my own digital streaming, so it'll never go away. I bought it that way. So as soon as we finish here, guess who's going to go buy the Blu-rays?
All right.
Because I need those. I need those. Real quick, I know we got to wrap up on time. We part of our show, what we do every week is we review a movie, and at the end of the show or the second half of our show, we usually do what we call categories. We pick our favorite performance, the scariest moment of movies, and since we got you here, we're kind of springing this on you out of nowhere. But we're thinking 1990 to 94. There's some great choices here, so we wanted to hit you with a couple of questions of your favorites. And I know this is like picking from your children because this is what you're doing, but. So I wanted to ask, like, because I mentioned earlier, like, one of my favorite, most underrated 80s or 90s films, I mentioned Brain Scan. Like, I know that was kind of popular in a way, but it feels like it's kind of gets forgotten a little bit. It has Edward Furlong in it, but it doesn't really get mentioned a lot. And I love Brain Scan. I think Brain Scan's fantastic. So I wanted to ask you, do you have a favorite underrated 90 to 94 movie that doesn't get mentioned as much?
Well, I used to. I've already. I'll mention a couple because I mean, it's impossible to choose one. You're right. I can't. You know, others will be neglected if I only choose one. But I already did mention Tom Savini's Night of the Living Dead. I
Big
stand
one.
by that proudly. I think people have clued in over the last couple of years, maybe that is a really good film. That's my spooky season go to every year. Every year when I'm in, you know, getting in spooky season mode, I pop that on and it gets me in the mood. Gets me in the mood. It's so great. But and you know, you mentioned Edward Furlong. You know, Pet Cemetery 2 is a really fun one. You know, I mentioned Tremors. I'm working up to it. I'm working up to it. I cannot pick, so I'll have to pick for one. But I would say Exorcist 3.
Oh, good.
Exorcist 3 is another one of those movies that, but I think that's getting a lot of talk these days as well, because, Exorcist Believer just came out. Um, I think a lot of people recognize that as it's pretty much The Exorcist and Exorcist 3 and everything else tries. Some succeed more than others, but Exorcist 3, I will never forget going to that theater on a Friday night, the night it opened, with low expectations, just wanting to see a horror movie and wanting to see The Exorcist 3. And it was incredibly engaging. It was a little more intellectual, but oh my God, I in that theater, I remember people started giggling. I think the statute of limitations has passed at this point with the big jump scare in that movie. But I won't describe it. But I remember in this big jump scare, the lead up to it is so brilliant by William Peter Blatty, who directed this and wrote the original Exorcist. He is just sitting there in this hospital setting for way too long. It's like you're waiting yourself in this hospital to be seen by a doctor, and it's going to take an hour. And I remember people started to giggle because they're like, wait a minute, you're almost taken out of this movie. Like, what's happening? Like, nothing's happening. Okay, let's pay attention because there must be a reason for this scene because nothing's going on. And then people started giggling, and then you got the jump scare. And 10 minutes full after that jump scare, you couldn't even hear the dialogue because everyone was just hooting and hollering and coming down from the adrenaline high of that insane scare. And so that's not only a great movie, but it's a great movie moment for me that I'll always remember. So that's why I'll choose that particular one. But I can keep going. I don't know.
I could echo Exorcist 3 because that was my introduction to the Exorcist world. I was just around the right age that when it released on like HBO or wherever it was, I watched it in full, and that was my first ingestion of that series, and it has aged really well, and I was completely engaged in it, even though I was too young to really grasp all the themes. But I think it's a great companion piece to The Exorcist. And then I would say for me, my most underrated from 90 to 94, it's not necessarily underrated in the horror community, but it's like, why didn't Nightbreed become a massive franchise?
Mm-hmm.
Nightbreed is just, and I think if it came out now, it would be the most popular like TV show on Netflix or whatever. Nightbreed just had that thing to it, and it drove me nuts that it like I'd go to my friends and go, "Have you seen Nightbreed?" And they're like, "Night what?" And I'm like, "No, it's amazing."
Clive Barker, man.
Yeah.
I I think Dead Alive is not as underrated, but we haven't given it any lip service. One of the cool things about the 90s was while the old guard was either doing more great horror or trying to figure out what was next, you had all these new players coming in, everyone from David Fincher to Peter Jackson to, a guy named Guillermo del Toro, who learned how to speak English from Mad Magazine and Famous Monsters, doing Kronos and a little later Mimic, and of course Blade 2. Amazing stuff, amazing stuff. Kronos is a good one that I'd like to point people out to. That's a good, that's a very original vampire film that
Yeah.
you've never seen before.
And I don't think it's underrated necessarily, but I adore. We didn't really talk about it too much, but I adore In the Mouth of Madness. I'm a huge John Carpenter fan. I have my Prince of Darkness signed poster right in front of me. You can't see it here, but I actually met John Carpenter last year, and like it was one of my bucket list moments. I had to meet John Carpenter, and I was like, "What do I want to get signed?" And I ended up picking Prince of Darkness because I adore that movie. That's one of his underrated films that doesn't get as much hype as The Thing or Halloween. But I love In the Mouth of Madness. And that soundtrack to that movie is also fantastic. But Sam Neill, Sutter Kane, I still remember the name. Like, it's just, that's an iconic movie. And that one doesn't get mentioned as much. Although I don't think it's really underrated, but I think that is one of John Carpenter's best films. So there's a lot in this. Like I said, it doesn't get the love it deserves in the early 90s, but There's some really good films in the really good horror films in the early '90s.
That's a good Halloween costume too. If you could find a contact lens that has like a double pupil, pop that in, and you could just be, a Sutter Kane fanatic.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Well, David, thank you so much for taking some time for us. We really do appreciate it. We cannot wait to set eyes on In Search of Darkness 1990 to 1994. We will absolutely be watching. I'm sure we'll be talking about it on the podcast. We cannot wait. And thank you so much for taking the time for us today. We really do appreciate it. And best of luck in whatever comes next. And if you hear from us again, it's because we're going to be asking for 95 to 99 as soon as possible.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let me direct everyone one last plug to 90shorrordoc.com, 90s 90shorrordoc.com. You can reserve your copy. We've got a whole year of interactive events and Q&As, and you get to talk to us, and you guys will be the first to hear about the new cast and everyone who's in it. Currently, we can't talk about it because of the SAG strike, and that's the only reason. But we crow about this stuff as soon as we get an opportunity. But check out the insane killer trailer that we put together. Really, really fun. I love it. I like listen to it in my car. Music from New Retro Wave is really good. But go to 90shorrordoc.com. You can see all the cool swag you can get your name in the credits. You see what's going on for the next coming year. And like I said, if you want to get your copy as soon as possible of the In Search of Darkness trilogy in your hand, you could do that as well and just go down a little bit, and you'll find out exactly where it is and how to order it. But guys, it's been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate you guys, shouting from the rooftops all about how cool 90s horror really is. That's the struggle that we've got, is ultimately reminding people this was a really great time for filmmaking, really creative, really cool, really interesting. And, stay tuned for In Search of Darkness, 1990 to 1994.
We cannot wait to watch it. We cannot wait. And we appreciate again for you taking the time. And hopefully we will speak again when the next one is coming out, because we're going to make you have to come back and see us again.
Track me down. I'd be happy to talk to you guys.
Thanks for geeking out with us, David.
Bye-bye.
My pleasure.